Good afternoon and welcome to this FSR online debate on what prospects for the global carbon market after COP26. Well, the title already speaks for itself. We wanted to create a space to discuss the conclusions, the outcome of the recent COP26, which just concluded. And we're going to do this with a list of distinguished experts from the IEA, from the Commission. But since I'm only the host at this online debate, and I'm not the spoiler, I'm going to now pass on the floor to my colleague Alberto Potosnik. Please, Alberto.
Thank you very much, Ilaria, and good afternoon to all of you also from my side, indeed. As Ilaria mentioned, we will now refer back and look at the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow, which took place only a couple of weeks ago. And this debate is going to review the outcome of this conference and discuss the implication of the progress or the lack of progress for the development of a global carbon market. As we all know, the parties to the Paris Agreement can use different instruments for trading emissions reductions at the international level through several mechanisms established under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And the development of mechanism compatible or markets compatible with Article 6 could allow countries more flexibility to achieve the net zero target with great economic efficiency, increase economies of scale, and therefore increase financial cooperation. The part of the Paris Agreement which is implemented Article 6 was the last one to be agreed, and it was agreed in Glasgow, and therefore it's a new framework. And the idea of today's debate is to discuss how now the implementation can proceed. This debate is also the third online debate of our project, the project of the Florence School of Regulation, the climate area, the LIFE Ditchette, deepening international cooperation and emission trading, co-financed by the EU LIFE program. So without further ado, because also I'm not specifically an expert on this, I would like to start the debate, the substantive part of the debate, and therefore I would like to invite Martin Hessian. He is the lead on international carbon market at DG Climate Action in the European Commission. He was also, over the last few years, the lead negotiation rules for international markets leading to Article 6 in Paris and the following negotiation its implementation in Glasgow. So, Martin, the screen is yours for setting a bit the scene for the debate today. And thank you very much for joining.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a privilege to be here. And I'm delighted to see that Kelly Kazar, an old colleague of mine who now works elsewhere, is online as well. It's been 6 years since Paris was agreed, and both Kelly and I worked very closely together to make sure there was an Article 6. It's got a history of lasts. I think it was the last piece of text that went into the Paris Agreement, and to some it was a bit of a surprise. And it's taken us 6 long years to implement it. Not because we're lazy or complicated people, but the topic is quite complicated. And I think the first thing to perhaps mention is that we have quite an elegant architecture under the Kyoto Protocol for markets, where a certain set of parties had one type of target, and another set of parties had no targets at all, but contributed by offsetting. And Paris upset that neat mix, but by giving us all parties have naturally determined contributions, but they are very different in form and content. And through Article 6, the challenge of accounting for those targets and for organising a mechanism within the context of different mitigation commitments. And it's a massive shift and change in context within which these rules had to be adopted. But what is Article 6? Article 6 has 3 components. The first one being an accounting framework for bilateral trading. That's Article 6.2. Article 6.4, a mechanism to replace the CDM mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol and the JI mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol, a single mechanism for all parties. And then not much talked about 6.8, but a balancing component, which is cooperation on non-markets, because many were skeptical of having markets at all in the treaty and did so only on condition that there was some mechanism for considering non-market cooperation. So all three elements have been discussed and agreed over the last 6 years. And finally, we've come to what we think is a balanced and fair outcome on the implementing rules. In the run-up to Glasgow, there was a controversy over the extent and the timing of accounting obligations coming into place. And I think we've been very successful in agreeing that all compliance uses now need to be accounted for using a thing called corresponding adjustment. Essentially, you adjust the emissions and removals covered by your NDC. And that happens regardless of whether the activities are within scope or outside scope. So for CORSIA and for NDC uses, it's pretty clear what you have to do, though there's still some implementation to be done in terms of the reporting and registry systems that are required. Under Article 6.4, and this is really something that's emerged only in the last couple of years and something the EU has been advocating for a long time, we have a mechanism that's now aligned to the Paris goals. The CDM mechanism typically credited against business as usual. Improvements on what would have happened anyway would typically be credited, passing baseline and additionality tests. We now have a mechanism where the allocation or the crediting baselines have reference to Paris goals, long-term strategies, and NDCs. So it's a fundamentally different mechanism, and that will also be difficult to implement, I think, in practice, but we have the rules and the framework there. And then we also have a framework or a committee around which we discuss non-market cooperation called the Glasgow Committee on Non-Market Approaches, which is to balance all of that out. In terms of implications, well, the first thing is that there's an amount of relief that the multilateral process can deliver. I mean, it's very challenging to implement carbon markets in any context. Within the UN, there are those that believe that it's not the appropriate forum within which to agree standards like this. It's not possible to agree them. And I think so. The first thing is a certain amount of relief that the multilateral process can deliver. I think the second implication is that we've got over the hump. I always say that the hump of engaging with the post-Kyoto world and what Paris implies. I've always said that markets are a little bit of a thermometer as to how parties are approaching the implementation of their targets. It was very difficult to get parties to engage on the issue of accounting. It was seen almost as a punishment. You're asking me to count what I've sold, and it's like, yes, that is indeed, it should at least be a zero-sum game. But also the concept of no increase in emissions, which we pressed for, the concept of consistency with long-term pathways to 1.5, the allocation principles. They were also things that hadn't really been internalized, I think, in some parties at least. So I think we have the political agreement that those things are important. There's a technical implementation to happen, but hopefully through implementing Article 6, those core issues will be part of the parties' considerations going forward. It was done at a cost. I think we've got robust long-term rules. It wasn't without compromise, and the compromise, I think, on our part was the carryover of units and the transition of projects into the system. And that was something that we didn't advocate for, sought to resist and manage. And to an extent, it's managed. We have a 2013 vintage for units, and we have the new rules applying to transition projects, which are adjusted. But in essence, that was somewhat of a compromise on our part. So at the expense of some short-term diminution in ambition from our point of view, there is an agreement to more ambitious rules from our point of view. I think I might leave it at that. There are lots of details and challenges to the system, including those that wanted to trade in non-greenhouse gas metrics, where we had to reconcile that with the whole idea and objective of the convention being a temperature goal and measured in greenhouse gas metrics. There are those that don't have fully quantified NDCs. There's a range of provisions in there that we had to address that are technically complex, but I think we did it in a good enough way. I'll finish on two aspects that were politically important: the contribution that the market might make to adaptation finance, and we essentially have the same formula, I think, as we had under Kyoto. There are compulsory levies on the 6.4 mechanism contributing to adaptation finance, and a strong urging of parties to contribute to finance when using markets under the bilateral approaches. There was an attempt to have a more compulsory levy covering all aspects of Article 6 in the run-up to the COP, but that wasn't finally agreed. Yeah, I think we'll leave it at that. There's a lot more to say, but yeah.
I'm sure there is, but thanks a lot, Martin, and congratulations for what you have achieved. It's quite remarkable, I think, and it was one of the highlights of the Glasgow conference last month. Next is Stefano Verde, a colleague of ours from the climate area of the Florence School of Regulation. Stefano will now be talking about the alignment possible reforms for integration.
Yes, thank you, Alberto. As you rightly pointed out at the beginning of this event is also part of a project that we are conducting here at Florence School of Regulation Climate, and which is called Ditchette, Deepening International Cooperation on Emissions Trading. And I'm saying this because the presentation I'm giving is focused on a question that is addressed there in this project. So it's a slight deviation from what Martin has so far said, but we will get back to that. And also, I hope that some insights will emerge that are still interesting and relevant for this, of course, for this event. So after this premise, I hope you can now see my
yep.
presentation.
If you put it in
yes,
slideshow,
screen.
Excellent. That's perfect.
Okay, so there, alignment possible for reforms for integration. The implicit word there is ETS, emissions trading systems. So it's basically the question that we are addressing is, well, what can be done to facilitate linkages between emission trading systems? As you probably know, there haven't been many linkages between ETSs, and so we have been reasoning on why and what can be done to have more of them. Well, this is information, basic information about the project. I invite you to check out the website. I'm just saying that the goal is to support European policymakers in international cooperation on emissions trading, and at the heart of this project, there's the carbon market policy dialogue, which we support scientifically, and we address five questions. The last of which is indeed the one I'm going to talk about now. Yes, the question how to facilitate integration of ETS, of course, needs to take into account the broader context. So I'm thinking of the context of a Paris Agreement and Article 6 specifically. So these linkages, of course, do not happen in a void. And we can think, as the diagram shows, I try to depict to represent it in this way. The circles are ETSs, which differ in size as well as many other possible dimensions. We can think of probably a growing number of emission trading systems that are indirectly linked to each other through the Article 6.4 mechanism, so the new CDM, let's say, with some quantitative, qualitative price limits, so some form of restricted indirect linking. There will be some of them, those that are connected one with each other by arrows, that will be also directly linked to each other. Again, with or without quantitative, qualitative, or price limits. Then there are others, perhaps fewer, that will be operate independent of the Article 6.4, so they will not be linked to that multilateral mechanism operate in isolation, or directly linked to other ETSs, again, with or without some form of limits. At the moment, if you think of the ETS, it could be correspond to the case of the blue ETSs there. So at the moment, at least, the ETS is not linked to the CDM mechanism, and so far doesn't. I mean, formally, it has to be seen whether it will link to Article 6.4. So it could be there outside the box and linked to a smaller ETS, like the Swiss ETS. Now, before addressing the main question of the presentation, so what can be done to facilitate linkages, just a step back on the relevance, the relevance of linking, and the very concept of linking. And the idea is really economic at heart, and basically is the idea of achieving efficiency gains through equalization of marginal compliance costs between ETSs. Not only that, there are also other benefits that come from these the linkage, the integration of ETSs, so increased market liquidity, lower price volatility, and so on. However, linkages pose issues. For instance, I mean, and one of the main reasons is that these linkages entail monetary and abatement transfers across jurisdictions, which need to be tolerated. And tolerance in this case not to take for granted, because there are local co-benefits of emissions abatement which are variable, and also international transfers, corresponding to allowances that are passed from one jurisdiction to another, may not be so popular. Also, there are domestic distributional effects that take place within each of the ETSs that are linked to each other, and general equilibrium effects that matter and need to be taken into consideration. From a global perspective, ETS linkages are of interest, I'd say, mainly for an environmental reason. By lowering costs, they can in principle enable higher ambitions, if those savings are used to increase ambition. And in the Paris world, we know there's still a gap between the sum of the NDCs in terms of climate mitigation and the agreement's ultimate target. So that is an important point. If linkages can be used to increase ambition. And the question of trading mitigation outcomes for increasing ambition is central in Article 6.4. We know it's actually embedded in we know now that in the rules that have been agreed have a provision that takes that into account, the 2% of the, I'm referring to the 2% of the credits under Article 6.4 that are put aside and are not traded, precisely to make sure that the transaction contributes to an overall mitigation to an overall increase in the mitigation at the global level. But for linkages between ETSs, so with in that sense bilateral agreements between ETSs or between parts that have ETSs and link to each other, it will be the governments that decide on whether to use a linkage to increase ambition or not. In some cases, the linkage will be used mainly as a lever for ambition. In others, it could be used as a lever for achieving cost savings. Now, going to the question of the main question of my presentation. Basically, in order to identify ways of facilitating linkages between ETS, we thought of starting from what we think are necessary conditions for linking. And so they are those that you can see there. We identified these 5 conditions. First, there needs to be general trust. A linkage will not take place if a jurisdiction does not trust the other or the other sufficiently. Secondly, there needs to be at least some overlap of acceptable carbon prices. So a linkage will not take place if a jurisdiction expects post-link carbon price prices to lie outside its acceptable range. And I'll get back to this in a minute. Thirdly, of course, the need to be net expected economic benefits at a macroeconomic level, not only at the ETS sector level. So a linkage will not take place if a jurisdiction does not expect a net benefit at a macroeconomic level. Fourth, the importance, the question of the environmental integrity. There needs to be confidence on environmental integrity. A linkage will not take place if a jurisdiction fears that the linkage comes at the expense of environmental integrity. And fifth, a linkage will not take place if a jurisdiction fears to lose control on the level of carbon prices after the linkage, meaning prices falling outside its acceptable range, a notion that I just mentioned before, and that I'll get back to that in a minute. So for each of these conditions, we think that we can derive ways to address, to fulfill these conditions. So concerning general trust, if trust is not there, well, increasing international cooperation between the parts would be really essential. On the question of the overlap between acceptable carbon prices, well, here maybe this was a bit difficult, but we thought that the introduction of a border carbon adjustment could facilitate some overlap or some more overlap between the acceptable price ranges of the parts that are involved. Concerning the expected macroeconomic benefits of the linkage, well, if this condition is not there, maybe other policy levers could be used. So I'm referring here to considering a so-called issue linkage as a way to increase expected benefits. And in particular, preferential trade agreements could be used as a lever here. Fourth, concerning environmental integrity, well, the question should be addressed at the start. At the linking, really at the linking agreement, which should include provisions for the environmental integrity of the linked ETS. So, in particular, include requirements on include an arrangements on the regulation of offsets and on changes in allowance supply. And finally, concerning the question of keeping control over prices, well, here as well, linking agreements could include provisions for maximum and minimum price bounds, what is normally called a price collar. So I mentioned the notion of an acceptable price range. Here we focus on it for a minute. Basically, yes, an ETS is of course a quantity-based instrument, but we think that there is always a range of carbon prices, whether explicit or de facto, that the policymaker considers acceptable given her own objectives and constraints. So when it comes to linking, the expected post-link carbon price needs to fall in the acceptable range of all jurisdictions that are considering the linkage. So in the diagram, in the graph on the left, we can see a situation where the expected post-link price does not fall in both parts. And so here, there's basically the linkage. There's not a necessary condition for the linkage to take place. On the right, instead, the post-link price, as represented by the black circle, does fall between in both ranges, and so this condition for a linkage is fulfilled. And this morning I was thinking, well, what example could be given here? And I was thinking of the UTS, of course, that yesterday I think reached 90 euros per ton of CO2, and the Californian system. I wonder whether this condition would be fulfilled in this case, given that I think the California ETS, I don't remember exactly now the price, but it's significantly lower than the European currently. So in this case, I wouldn't be able to tell whether we would be on the left situation or on the situation depicted on the right. So even when a situation like, I mean, the expected post-link price does fall in the acceptable price range of the jurisdictions that consider a linkage, still a jurisdiction may be concerned that future events, so after the linkage, or behavior of the partner after the linkage, could drive the carbon price, supposed to have the prices have converged after the linkage. So the events or behavior of the partner drive the post-link carbon price off outside the acceptable range. This could happen due to economic or technological shocks. It could happen also for changes in the policy mix affecting regulated emissions in the partner jurisdictions. So there is this uncertainty, basically, ex ante, about what happens after the linkage. And so we thought that to address this uncertainty, which certainly discourages linkages, a linking agreement could provide a price collar, could provide for a price collar. And if so, that the collar would remove the risk of losing control on carbon prices after the linkage. So as such, this could be an effective approach for facilitating the establishment of new linkages. Compared to, this is just a remark on this type of arrangement, that compared to linking with quotas or on allowance transfers and other form of restricted linkage, linking with a price collar allows for full trade gains within the agreed collar, of course. Also, price collars may be a key for effective coordination of linked ETSs. And we could think of clubs of linked ETSs differentiated by price level. So by price level. Of course, linking with a price collar requires that all jurisdictions involved are happy to have a collar. And as the UTS so far shows, it's not granted that they all can or want to have a collar. So to conclude, governments, it would be governments that decide on the purpose of a linkage between their ETSs. In some cases, a linkage would be used as a lever for ambition. In others, as a lever for achieving cost savings. We have suggested a few ways in which linkages between ETSs may be facilitated. And there are those there: to build trust through cooperation, to use border carbon adjustment, WTO compatible with border carbon adjustments, to use also preferential trade agreements, to negotiate linking agreements, including provisions on the regulation of offsets and changes in allowed supply. This usually happens already. And also to negotiate linking agreements that include provisions on a maximum price bounds for after the linkage takes place. We focus on price collars indeed, which could be a key for effective coordination of linked ETSs. And finally, yes, in such a system where there are clubs of linked ETSs differentiated by price level, if an ETS linked to one or more ETSs that are in a higher price band, then the linkage would clearly serve as a lever for increased environmental ambition. And we think that that's a nice feature of this hypothetical system that we have envisioned. Okay, with this I've concluded, and thank you for your attention. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Stefano. I think between you and Martin, you put quite a lot out for discussion. And now I'm giving the screen to Simone Borghesi, the director of the FSR Climate Area, also the president of the European Association of Environmental and Resource Economists, to moderate the panel, run the polls, and then manage the Q&A session. He will also draw some concluding remarks at the end, because unfortunately Jost Delbecq is unable to join us. He's not well, and we wish him to recover soon. So Simone will also provide some concluding remarks before I close. So Simone, the screen is yours now.
Thank you, Alberto. Thank you, Martin and Stefano, for a great introduction into today's topic, the insights from Martin directly from Glasgow, and the presentation of Stefano complement each other greatly, in my view. What we want to do now is to move to a panel discussion. And we have three speakers today with us, Luca Lore, Kelly Kizier, and Billy Pizer, that will provide their view, hopefully will share their view on a hot topic. Basically, we all know that there are conflicting opinions on the outcome of Glasgow and also on the Article 6, which we have long waited for. Recently, I was reading an interview to Robert Stavins, who was defining the Article 6 agreement as, you can see it as a half full glass or a half empty glass, but he says, in my view, is a 3/4 glass, full glass. So let's say my general question to all of you would be, what's your share of the glass? What's your opinion in what have been achieved? So let me go one by one. I'll first introduce Luca Lore. He leads the International Energy Agency work in the OECD IEA Climate Change Expert Group. He has been working a lot on the technical issues in the international climate change negotiations and in the Paris Agreement implementation, providing important insights on this. He's also leading the organization of the annual emission trading workshop that IEA organizes with IETA and EPRI, and works a lot on net zero more recently. So a broad view on these issues, and I would like to invite him to give his view and share it with us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Simone. And first of all, thanks also to all the FSR colleagues for the kind invitation and for the opportunity to share this panel with such a distinguished speaker. It's really an honor for me to be here with you today. And in the interest of time, I'll try to keep my intervention short and focus mainly on 2 points. One, as you were trying to answer your question. So the first, the fact that we had an outcome, what that implies, and what's the quality of the outcome that we had on COP26, at COP26 on Article 6. And at the IEA, and especially through the work that we do with the OECD on the Climate Change Expert Group, we are observers of the process, and we do inputs into technical inputs to the process through technical papers and technical dialogues. So the first point, reflecting on the fact that we had an outcome on Article 6 negotiations at COP26, I think having an outcome was not a given. If you ask people before COP26, it was really a 50% chance, even experts that were involved in the field. So contextualizing the result, I think it's quite telling what most countries repeated at the end in the closing plenary, that the text that we got for Article 6 in particular was not what most countries were looking for when we arrived to Glasgow, but it is a good basis to start working with. This means, to me, it's a telling element, because it means that the proof text reflects a political compromise, as Martin was saying. So I think most of parties were not 100% happy about it, but there were some bits and pieces of being happy. So the negotiations on Article 6 were really long and complex. As Martin said, it entailed between like 5 and 6 years in the making, and COP26 was seen as our last chance by many. And in my view, as an observer, some of the points that were in the negotiations were had a binary distinction, were either black or white solutions. There were no gray in between. And so the fact that we came to an agreement was already quite positive to me. And in my opinion, negotiations were ably managed and orchestrated also by the chair and co-facilitators. And there was an extremely instrumental and useful role of the UNFCCC Secretariat. So, but for anyone who follows the negotiations, this time we had very timely and very well-written draft texts that came out very quickly after discussions. And this, I think, did really help quite a lot. Another critical element for me was also the political willingness to find an agreement. There was definitely a political lever, not only from a technical point of view from many countries, but also political willingness to get an agreement. And this basically led to a very encouraged and constructive spirit of collaboration in Glasgow. And this brings me to my second point, which is the quality of the outcomes. And as you said, and also Martin said, I think many will read the outcomes on Article 6 in different ways. So this is a compromise. We said it is a compromise, and many parties have to compromise in on different points. And so there are some positive bits and some less positive bits on Article text. And I will focus my intervention only on 6.2 and 6.4 because they are the market related, and those where our group, the CCAG, has done more analysis on. So I will, to save space and time for discussion later, I will just focus on 4 main points. The first was already mentioned briefly by Martin, which is the accounting framework. I think on the positive side, this is a very strong framework. The fact that corresponding adjustments are required on all ITMOs transfers, so international transfer mitigation outcome transfer, it's very important. And there is also an important role that is given to the host parties to authorize the credits in Article 6.4. And so for those credits in Article 6.4 that are not authorized, a corresponding adjustment is not required. On the less positive side is that in the accounting framework, the methods to apply a corresponding adjustment were left as a menu of options, not as a hierarchy of options. So basically parties can pick and choose the method that is more convenient for them. And one of these accounting methods is called the averaging accounting method. And there is a particular type of NDC, which is a single year NDC, that if the accounting method is applied, if the averaging accounting method is applied to this single year NDCs, there is a risk that this could lead to double counting of emissions eventually. We've done quite a lot of technical work on this. However, in the work program, I think there is a good hook for further work to analyze the method that could demonstrate the representativeness of the averaging for corresponding adjustments. And so it is recognized that this could be problematic, and there is some work that could be done in the future on this. My second point, which I think is generally overlooked, but I think it's quite an important issue, is that there was a provision for no banking of ITMOs, of intervention mitigation outcomes, between NDC implementation periods. On the positive side for this means that basically mitigation outcomes must be used in the same NDC implementation period in which they were generated. And this could limit the potential effects of, let's say, hot air that could be generated in case baselines are not implemented in the way they should in the Paris Agreement, so in a very conservative way. And so they could limit this effect only to one NDC period. On the less positive side for this, I think there are potential challenges that are associated with other decisions that are outside the Article 6 room, so for common timeframes, for instance. So there is much more work to be done there. Another issue that Martin mentioned as well, I think on the baselines is very important, and this is my second last point. On baselines, I think Martin already mentioned that there was very stringent principles for baseline setting and additionality. And I think it's important to understand that these were both for 6.2 and for 6.4. And these encourage ambition over time. They need to be below business as usual. I think these are very important, and they need to align with the NDCs and long-term strategies as well, and with long-term Paris Agreement goals. And even if there are some, there is also a menu of options where countries can pick and choose in certain instances. Even if there is some methodology baseline approaches, such as the historical emissions, that would not be necessarily per se aligned with the Paris Agreement, these have to be adjusted downwards. So it is, in any case, positive to have these environmental integrity hooks on baselines. At the same time, what I think it would be a little bit challenging is to translate these high-level principles into tangible and technical and implementable rules. So what is now the challenge is to actually try to, for instance, the alignment of the baselines with the NDCs. For those who have worked on baseline before would know that it's very difficult to do, because sometimes NDCs are not very well defined. And so it's difficult to link individual projects and baselines with high-level policies and measures that sometimes are not well defined. So there is quite a lot of work there. And then my final point is on the CR transition, in particular on the credits one. As Martin said, it was the result of a compromise, but on the bright side is that this is also limited in scope and use. So CRs cannot be converted to the new credits in Article 6.4 mechanism, and they can only be used towards achievement of the first NDC. So there is, it's a relatively small price to pay, as Martin said, for a stronger compromise on accounting. Although of course this allows pre-2020 mitigation to be used towards post-2020 goals. And so as bottom line, 3 points. I think this is a very good outcome. The more that I'm starting digesting this outcome, I think it is a very robust outcome for giving trust in the long term in the new carbon markets, although there is a lot of work to be done. And I think the work, for instance, that the FSR through the Live Ditchette project has done, for instance, in linking, but also BTSs, but also in many other instances, it would be very, very valuable there. And a second point is that to understand the real and fully the implications of this text, it's going to be difficult and will take time. We probably gonna have to wait a few years, as it was the case for the Kyoto Protocol mechanism, before understanding exactly what are all the nuances that are there in the text. And this will come just with practice and as we are going to implement these instruments. And the last but not least, I think there is another element that has not been mentioned so far, which is the interplay with the voluntary carbon markets as well. Of course, Article 6 is not meant to regulate the voluntary carbon markets, but of course the two are somehow they have an influence on each other. And so how the voluntary markets will react to Article 6 is still to be seen, although at the moment we're already seeing some emerging approaches coming, and very happy to discuss this further later. So thanks very much for your time. I'll give it back to you, Simone.
Thank you, Luca. Thank you for this very comprehensive view of what is going on, and what will go on, based also on your words. Thank you also for your kind words towards our project. We try to give our small contribution in this sense. And what I take from your short illustration is that, okay, it's a political compromise, but on the other hand, there is also the political willingness to go on, and probably the willingness prevailed somehow over some difficult aspects that otherwise would have compelled us to postpone things even more. So thank you for this. And I will now move to Kelly. Kelly Kiesier, just a few words to introduce her, is the Vice President for Global Climate at EDF, Environmental Defense Fund. She works a lot on promoting ambitious and effective climate policy and company action. She works on multilateral climate agreements and global cooperation for carbon markets, on international carbon markets, design, performance, accounting, transparency. So, I mean, the right person for this debate, certainly. She has a long expertise. She was a senior official at DG Climate and at the Irish Environmental Protection Agency. She was EU lead market negotiator in international climate negotiations for 14 years, and also co-chair of the UNFCCC on the negotiation on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Unfortunately, I learned that Kelly camera is not helping today. It's not collaborating, but I hope we can hear you, and the mic, if so, the mic is yours, Kelly.
Thank you so much, Simone. I think, between Luca and Martin, we've covered many aspects of the agreement on Article 6. I will weigh in on my view on its success. You said that Professor Robert Stavin said that he thought it was sort of a 3/4 of a glass full, and I think that's probably accurate. I also think that the measure of success depends a bit on your expectations going in. So to get 3/4 of a glass full after the 6 very difficult years we've had on Article 6, I think is basically a roaring success. So, and I think Luca mentioned this. There was no certainty going into COP26 that we were going to get agreement on Article 6 rules. So I think that in itself is a massive success. In terms of the detail, I think those 3/4 include the fact that Martin already mentioned, that the accounting framework agreed makes it very clear that in all cases for compliance use, transfers, international cooperation through carbon markets has to be appropriately accounted for. It requires a corresponding adjustment. And that has not been a certainty for many, many years. So I think that's a great success. And I also think it's a great success that it is the choice of the host country. It is triggered by the authorization of the host country, that accounting. So, the host country must know what it's authorizing, must understand how that fits into its decarbonization plans. And that will require, a different level of scrutiny in terms of what I need to meet my own NDC and what I have available for trade. And I think that level of scrutiny is going to be really helpful as we move towards, net zero by around mid-century. I think it also, Luca touched on this a little bit, but it provides a pathway rather than a requirement, but it's nonetheless a pathway for accounting for voluntary carbon markets, which are recently booming. So it provides for the option that in their pursuit of their voluntary goals, companies can support the implementation of the current NDC, or they can go beyond that through an authorized transfer that is associated with a corresponding adjustment. And I think providing that pathway without the requirement is going to provide a lot of certainty for the voluntary carbon market and can help to get private capital flowing from developed to developing countries, which is hugely important. In the quarter of the glass that's probably not full, I think is the CER carryover. There were a couple of dates on the table, 2013, 2016. I think from our perspective, we wish that cutoff date had been 2016 rather than 2013, but that was part of the political compromise. I think we still don't know the full impact of that. The UN has estimated that as 120 million tons. We've seen other estimates of about 300 million tons. There is a detail there that I think we need to be pretty careful about as the negotiations move on, and that's the registration date, because there are actually a couple of different registration dates in the CDM. Some that were spurred by EU legislation. So we just have to make sure that ends up as conservative as possible. But I do think that it's a success that their use, as Luca mentioned, is restricted to the first NDC commitment period. And to be honest, the CR carryover was always going to be part of any political deal. So I think we got a lot of strong accounting rules out of this. There's accounting for compliance inside, outside, upside down. So inside the scope, outside the scope in every way, which is incredibly strong. The CR banking is limited to the first NDC period and potentially limited to around 120 million tons, which is pretty successful. And we have this pathway for voluntary carbon markets. Of course, the details of the implementation, as Luca mentioned, in particular for the baseline rules that have been established for Article 6.4 are going to be incredibly important, and not just important for the 6.4 mechanism. We know from experience that the voluntary carbon market standard setting bodies will be influenced by the decisions taken for this UN mechanism. So if we can really tighten the rules around baselines there, we can have a much broader impact than this mechanism. And I think that could be incredible as well. So overall, I agree with Stevens, a 3/4 glass success which is much more than I hoped for going into COP26.
Thank you, Kelly. I think we are on the same line of Robert, but also somehow Luca before, because Luca started to say there was 50-50 possibility to have an agreement. And now we have an agreement, we are 75% happy, so to speak. So the percentage seems to be pretty good compared maybe to our expectations, given the long difficulties that we experienced in the past. And now I would like to know the percentage of that Billy sees. Let me again introduce him as the other speakers, although many of you certainly know him very well. Billy is the Vice President for Resources for the Future, for Research and Policy Engagement at Resources for the Future, was the Susan King Professor at the Stanford School of Public Policy at Duke, and is also a research associate at NBR. He has a PhD and MA from Harvard. In the past, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Environment and Energy at the US Department of the Treasury from 2008 to 2011. He works on how we value the future benefits of climate change mitigation, how environmental regulation and climate policy can affect production costs and competitiveness, and how the design of market-based environmental policies can address the needs of different stakeholders. He works on these aspects and actually many more. He has published in the top leading journals in the field, and I have to say it was quite inspiring to our own research as well. So it's a real pleasure to have you with us today, Billy, and we are now eager to know your view of the glass.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate, as well as for that very kind introduction. I guess I would say, first of all, I should give the caveat, I have not been, as much involved in the negotiations at the level of detail that I think, Luca and Kelly and certainly Martin have been involved in. I would actually say, I think it's almost full. And I say that because, if you step back and you recognize that, Article 6 is about trading mechanisms against NDCs, against the backdrop where NDCs within the Paris Agreement themselves are not binding commitments. And so, in my mind, the goal of Article 6 was to have Article 6. And as has been discussed, it was never a sure thing we were going to get Article 6. So I think Article 6, with the accounting that it has, is actually, I'm not quite sure. I mean, certainly I can think of other things you might want, but it's in the last few percent, maybe 99% or something, 98%. It just seems very full that we have a deal and we can move forward. Another piece of why I would say that, and then I want to make a few points, is that inherent in ITMO trading is an agreement, by a buyer and a seller. And so all of this structure that has been set out in Article 6 is then going to get further curtailed by the choices different jurisdictions make about how to use these, units. And, certainly if the past is any guide, a lot of the, purchasing jurisdictions like the European Union are quite scrutinous of their linking, as Stefano was saying. So, I look at, whatever weaknesses remain in the, in the accounting mechanism, as Luca was saying, I think are probably going to get, enforced by jurisdictions as they choose to link. That would be my guess. This provides the undergirding. Now we can move forward. Jurisdictions can start doing things, and I think they'll put a lot more constraints on what they do. And that also goes for the overhead of all the CERs that are coming in that Kelly was talking about. I would be quite skeptical that a lot of those are going to get picked up by anybody, because everybody knows exactly what they are, and they probably want to buy real reductions. So I really just wanted to make 3 quick points. One is about the general role of carbon pricing generally. The second is kind of about linking, which a lot of what Stefano covered. And then the third one would just be a little bit about how I think Article 6 is most likely to be used in my mind. So, the first point about carbon pricing, I think it's very important to realize that, as much as we economists love carbon pricing, because it promotes least cost solutions and all that, as well as potentially raising revenue, depending on how you do it. It's important to recognize or remind ourselves about the limitations of, carbon markets. One is that they tend to raise the price of goods more than other forms of regulation, because the regulated firms are paying not just to reduce their emissions, but they're also paying for the embedded carbon that occurs. Now, this is great from an efficiency standpoint because it encourages people to buy less carbon intensive goods, but it also changes the price of goods by a lot more. And especially as we kind of work our way through towards total decarbonization, it's a much bigger piece, the price of the carbon that is being emitted. And so this has two important consequences. One is that it creates larger trade issues, and we're seeing those in the ongoing discussions about border measures. The other is that it creates more redistribution. And, you can think of that as something we can solve by giving away allowances to poor people or whoever it is that we think are affected. But it's important to realize that all those redistributions are very crude. When you're trying to redistribute to poor people, for example, there are going to be people within that group that use a lot of carbon, and there are going to be people that use a lot less carbon. And so it tends to be very crude, and you have a lot of what we tend to call horizontal equity issues. And I would just emphasize that as we get to greater and greater ambition, these issues become larger and larger. We were talking about issues with trade 10 years ago in the United States, and we were thinking about, a carbon policy in 2009, 2010. But the prices were much lower, and as the EU has gotten up to maybe $100 a ton, on the horizon, those are much larger issues for trade, and they're much larger issues for redistribution. So I would just emphasize that all the reasons that, come up and lead us to think about a package of policies as opposed to just carbon pricing become, I think, even more important as we go to more ambitious policies. The second thing I would mention, Stefano covered a lot of this. When you're talking about full linking between trading programs, kind of like the Article 6.2 mechanism, there's a lot of harmonization that is needed. And right at the top, I would put there needs to be an agreement, as Stefano mentioned, about what the prices are that different jurisdictions want. And economists tend to think about how the greatest gains from trade come from a high price jurisdiction trading with a low price jurisdiction. But the reality is the high price jurisdiction probably made a pretty conscious decision. They wanted that high price, and the low price jurisdiction wanted the low price. And even though there are net gains to trade for everybody, the purchasers in the low price jurisdiction are going to face higher prices, and the sellers in the high price jurisdiction are going to face lower prices. So there's a bunch of redistribution going on that I think is really important, and is probably something that most jurisdictions don't want. So I totally agree with Stefano's point that jurisdictions that are linking are going to be jurisdictions that, aside from having the same designs, basically want the same price. Ergo, there's probably not going to be that much gains to trade. There may be stability and other advantages, but I think the linking is something that's really going to happen between jurisdictions that have a lot of other things that are in common, and they're connected in a lot of other ways, like the European Union. And things like that. So this kind of goes to my, last point, which is that, if I had to guess, I would say the most important parts of Article 6, 6.2 will allow jurisdictions like the EU to include, other jurisdictions that are not part of the EU, and kind of expand incrementally where it makes sense, or it may allow parts of the United States to link with Canada in some way that makes sense. But I think 6.4 is probably going to be the most, likely candidate, just like the CDM in some ways was, more heavily used mechanism than others in the Kyoto Protocol. So, I think the fact that there's a mechanism there that allows project-based crediting, which I think is very important to people, they can see what's going on, but at the same time, it's accounted for in the NDC is super important. So, I think Article 6 did a great job of getting us across the finish line, having something in place that people could feel comfortable layering on their own jurisdictional interests when they set up whatever linking they're going to do. So I think it was a great outcome, that we had an outcome that we can move forward, and I expect jurisdictions themselves to create the additional structure that's needed to execute this in a good way. Thanks.
Thank you, Billy, first of all, for what was needed, somehow the academic perspective that complements the negotiation perspective. And I couldn't agree more on the aspect that you were underlining. I think the first and the second aspect had something in common, the redistribution aspect that we should take carefully into account with carbon pricing and with linking as well. Talking about percentages, I think it's time for our questions to launch some polls and see the percentage that come up from the audience. So let me first go to our first question that my team prepared for you all. The question is, what means should parties to the Paris Agreement prioritize to achieve the targets in their own NDCs? NDCs should be achieved only through domestic mitigation actions or only through international cooperation mechanisms under Article 6, or primarily through domestic mitigation actions and to a lesser degree with Article 6, or primarily through international cooperation under Article 6 and to a lesser extent domestic actions. And we also allow you not to know. You can choose, I simply don't know. So I will leave a few moments for you to reflect on this. In the meantime, I choose my preferred answer.
You can't.
I can't?
No, panelists cannot. I'm sorry.
What a shame. Okay.
I think you can't, indeed.
Okay, better. I won't tell you what I would choose. So let's wait a second, and here the results come. Well, we have a large majority of option C, primarily through domestic mitigation actions, and lesser degree with Article 6, 69%, and 31% the other way around, basically, through international cooperation and to a lesser extent, domestic actions. Well, is it expected? Is it what you think? Let me ask Luca, Kelly, Billy, Martin. I start with Luca. Luca, your first reaction.
Yeah, thanks. I think that would have been also my preference, the one that's been voted the most, because I indeed think that the international cooperation is important, but domestic mitigation actions should be prioritized first. And international cooperation should be used to, as the Article 6 in particular has been conceived, to enhance the ambition. So this should be on top of achieving current NDC targets, and if not, only limited to those very hard to abate sectors in certain countries, but still always accompanied through by other domestic mitigation actions. So yes, that would have been also my choice if I could have voted.
Thank you, Luca. Kelly?
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's, you know, it's the principle we've had for some time now. You know, Kyoto Protocol had supplementarity. We know that we have to prioritize domestic action, but I think international carbon markets, linking emissions trading systems, provide the possibility of going further than we would otherwise, and that's the important thing.
Thank you, Kelly. Martin.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree with domestic action, but perhaps just two factual elements to it. From the EU has decided on a domestic target to 2050, and it's done that fully in the expectation that that's what we need to do to get to net zero globally, you know, that's a political calculation, but also a scientific, mathematical calculation that we've made. And I would say also that it's not possible to offset yourself out of deep emission cuts. Fundamentally, the math doesn't allow it. So the challenge for markets will be that the room for emission reductions should be massively reduced, and the role of removals will necessarily be enhanced over the period. And I think that's not something that's enough talked about, essentially, that we certainly need to do more domestic action if this is to work out mathematically, and also if we're to have a robust and healthy market, the constraints that we have suggest that we should be moving from emission reductions purchases over to removals.
Thanks. And Billy.
You know, I was thinking about the way the question was worded in terms of what should happen versus what will happen, or what we think will happen. And, you know, I was also thinking about, you know, if we went back 20 years, and I don't know how many people here are old enough, it's kind of weird to be saying that, but, you know, I think in some sense, 20 years ago, we wouldn't have even asked this question. We would have just assumed that it didn't matter. I mean, economists at least would assume it didn't matter, that we set up the Kyoto Protocol. And I think, you know, in the United States, we were talking about how, you know, we would be buying a bunch of allowances, or Japan would be buying a bunch of allowances. We didn't really think about how much, I mean, in the United States, economists didn't think about how much was supplemental and how much wasn't. That was a concept that kind of entered into Kyoto and became increasingly reinforced. But now I think, as everybody has said, you know, people have recognized that countries don't want, I mean, this fear that countries would buy their way out has actually been probably supplemented by or replaced by a recognition that this idea that we're going to buy a bunch of reductions somewhere else kind of hinges on the idea there's some cheap reductions out there that we actually are willing to buy from a country that has a less ambitious policy in some sense. And I think that recognition of that reality has meant that there's just much lower expectations of what countries will do outside of their domestic context. And it's put a, you know, kibosh on the potential of markets, you know, to really dramatically lower costs globally. So, you know, I think where we are now is a function of just where, you know, kind of the politics has gone, that people don't want to buy reductions from another country that has low prices, you know, as well as, you know, the reality of more ambitious policies, which do require deeper cuts, as Martin was saying.
Thanks. And maybe one fast word also from the home team. Stefano, do you want to comment on the results?
I was not expecting to be asked, but well, I was maybe a bit surprised by the high number of responses for using Article 6 as opposed to domestic action. Maybe this reflects the bias, you know, of the European view on this matter, and but yeah, apart from this, they make yeah.
Simone, one other thing I just wanted to add, you know, what's interesting is the United States, I'm pretty sure under the Obama administration in their NDC said they would not use any extra non-domestic credits. So it's like the US has totally turned around from 97 to 2015.
Yeah, true. And we have seen this sort of switching between Europe and the US also in other contexts in the past. So it's interesting to observe this kind of process in the run towards the targets. Okay, I would like to launch a second poll, a second question. And well, in a way, you already gave your answer, but still I would like to hear the view of the audience. The question we prepared was, how satisfied are you with the agreement on Article 6 found at COP26? Extremely satisfied, satisfied, neutral, unsatisfied, extremely unsatisfied, or I don't know. So again, a few moments for people to vote, to express their preference. Again, I will not do anything, promised. I will not write the percentage. Well, if I knew in advance, probably I would have written this in terms of half full, half empty, 1/4, 3/4, but that's for next event. So let's see, as soon as we have the answer. And the answer is quite positive. 80% are satisfied and 20% are neutral. Well, again, very quick roundtable. Did you expect these percentages, or was it influenced by your viewpoint somehow? Luca.
Well, difficult to say. I think definitely what as we discussed, I think the 3/4 half full glass, I think is the best picture of, at least also from my side, of the outcomes. And yeah, I hope that our views somehow not influenced, but at least informed the audience in making the choices here.
Yeah. Very fast, I'll move to Kelly for a comment, if you have any.
No, I mean, it's nice to be backed up like that. I think, you know, the measure of success is based on expectations, and I think what happened at COP26 exceeded at least my expectations. So that's how I'm measuring success right now. You know, ask me a year from now if the implementation of it gets completely skewered at COP27. We probably have a different view, but so far so good.
Martin, do you feel backed up?
Well, I don't know that I ever answered how full my glass was, and I tried to be neutral most of the time. I think I said I was happy it was over, mainly. I do think it is a broadly good outcome, but I like to mix metaphors as well. It's a question not only of how full the glass is, but what's in the glass, and I'm going to quote my elderly grandmother, who would say that there's both eating and drinking in it. It's an Irish phrase. It's a thick soup, and it'll require an amount of work, I think. That's all I think about. But there's a good basis for further work and making it better. That's what I would say.
Thank you. And Billy?
I guess I felt like the panel seemed more positive than the audience, but I wondered, at least, so I feel like maybe I didn't convince people. I wonder where people were before we made the comments that we did, which seemed like they were pretty positive. It would have been good to do like a before poll, do the discussion, and then do an after poll.
It's true, very true. And to be honest, within the Live Ditchette project, we have used this kind of approach, but in other contexts, to see ex ante and ex post whether people change their minds. Stefano, you wrote a comment that I agree very much with. You wrote, at least in Italy, the media have given very little space to the outcome of Article 6. And I fully agree. Do you want to comment more on this?
No, just that, so maybe I think the message that comes out of this event is, is not granted to, it's kind of different from what the general public hears. So I think it's still good, even though we all agree here, basically. I think it's good that we convey something. What we convey is maybe not so obvious to most people.
Definitely, because I think this is a quite technical issue that people are not even aware of, if I can say so. We're talking in public context, and so it's sometimes difficult to convey the nitty-gritty aspects of the technicalities, but they're extremely important. So we have to be very careful on this. So I would like to open the floor to questions from the audience, if any. You can.
There is also another poll, I believe. If you
yes,
want one.
But I just wanted to make sure that there is room for questions from the audience. But if not, I could launch the poll or ask some questions myself, because I have my own questions. But let's proceed with a third poll, because I think that's quite an interactive way of involving our audience. And so our third poll is the following: Article 6, as agreed, will be a game changer for the speed of global emissions reduction. And the options are fully agree, rather agree, neutral, rather disagree, fully disagree, or simply I don't know. Again, a few moments to reflect and let us know your opinion on this. Now, as you see from the colors, we go to the lower part. We move a little bit down with rather agree 25%, neutral 38%, rather disagree 25%, and I don't know 13%. Luca, did you expect a more cautious, let's say, reply on this?
Yeah, I would. I was not expecting such a different approach, and I think this is a very good question. That's why I think it's very difficult to have a stark decision. My point of view, personal point of view, I would rather disagree on this, because I don't think that that Article 6 would be, I wouldn't define it as a game changer for the speed of global emission reduction. I think even within the negotiators arena, and I hope that Kelly and Martin would also agree on this, that the ambition, that what would drive the speed of global emission reduction is actually the increase of ambition that comes from NDCs, so from the main policies, rather than Article 6. Article 6, once again, can increase ambition, but is not meant to be the main instrument to raise ambition. So that's why I would put rather disagree on this.
Yes, and I agree with your disagreement. Kelly.
I mean, as usual, Luca has said it better than I could. Typical. Thanks, Luca. Taking my. No, I mean, the thing I would add is that I think in the absence of Article 6 rules, there was a lot of uncertainty, and markets don't love uncertainty. So, you know, countries didn't understand the context in which they were playing, and that was creating barriers. I think we still have some uncertainty for the voluntary carbon market, but like I said, we have a pathway rather than a requirement, which is going to be really important. So now how that's implemented through norm setting standards, sort of voluntarily adopted standards, is going to be incredibly important. So I don't think we understand the full impact, but we now have a framework in which we can hang all of this, which is what we didn't have before. It's really important.
Thank you, Kelly. Martin?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, we've always taken the view that this is a means to an end, not an end in itself. And the level of demand out there is not high. I think we're told that voluntary markets are growing because of an interest in net neutrality claims, etc. And it remains to be seen whether the demand that was promised in Glasgow emerges, and then whether that demand is translated into demand for international markets. And in a way, we shouldn't believe our own rhetoric enough. People are saying markets are a means by which you increase ambition. So that kind of suggests that in some way, because we've cleared out these rules, as Kelly said, and made it clear how one would cooperate, that ambition can follow. But it's not inevitable. So I don't think it's a game changer in that sense. I think it poses some really interesting questions for countries that want to do international markets, and that I'm glad about, which is essentially, how's it going to contribute to Paris goals, and how are you going to account for it? Because those two things were not on the table really in the run-up to Glasgow, but not a game changer.
And Billy, did it change the game? Will it change the game for you?
Yeah, I'm in agreement with the disagreement, I guess. The one thing I would add, two quick things I would just add to the comments is, again, from a historical perspective, this is a very different story. I think, 20 years ago, there was a lot of focus on the role of trading and promoting ambition, and an expectation that costs would be dramatically lower because of trading. I think our expectation and our realization now is just a limit to how much countries are interested and willing to pursue reductions outside their jurisdiction. With the exception of these particular linked systems like the EU and a few of maybe others. And then the second comment, I forgot to mention this earlier, but Kelly made a great point about the voluntary market and how Article 6 could facilitate the voluntary market. And I think that is kind of a big unknown question, to me at least, is, it does seem like there could be quite an interesting opportunity there, because right now the voluntary market is, kind of the Wild West. And if this really promoted more voluntary programs to embrace, something that was a little bit more rigorous. And as you said, it could be used to support an NDC or against an NDC. It gives a lot of flexibility to private actors to think about how they want to do that. Seems like it might facilitate something that we don't have right now.
Sure, and actually on the voluntary carbon markets, there is a question now by Matt, who writes, the quality of any Article 6 transfers is linked to the ambition and baseline setting of selling country NDCs. Many sell countries have low capacity credibility in their inventories. Several have low ambition, partly due to the low ability to implement mitigation. So in this context, how much do these markets increase ambition? How can the voluntary carbon markets contribute to ambition? Again, I will go around the table and start with Luca. Sorry, Kelly. Hopefully it doesn't steal the answer.
Thanks. Just a couple of quick words on this. I think in Article 6, it changes slightly the perspective from Kyoto Protocol. It doesn't only depend on the selling country. There is also a big role of the buying countries, especially through, let's say, bilateral on the bilateral agreements, also to decide to buy certain type of credits from, or certain type of ITMOs from another selling countries. And the selling country always have to keep in mind that there is a corresponding adjustment to be applied. So I don't think the selling countries will be encouraged to sell the cheapest mitigation option, so to speak, or because that would then incur in another addition in their NDC balance, and they would have to meet the same goals with a more expensive, more technically difficult mitigation. So I'm not sure this is I think before this type of credits or ITMOs are going to be in the market, as Matt is saying in the question, there would be some countries, especially selling countries, that would have to think twice before doing that. So I'm not sure how much low quality we will see through Article 6. Also, in Article 6.4 mechanism is going to be a centralized mechanism, and hopefully, if the principles are implemented, we will see relatively high quality credit, especially for those that are authorized by the countries. And in terms of voluntary markets, we will probably need another webinar dedicated on this directly. But I think that yes, there is a lot of interest at the moment in voluntary markets, and as Billy rightfully mentioned, at the moment is a wild west. It's there is a need to find clear rules over there, although of course there is no centralized body that could do that. And so it's going to be the demand side that is going to be the important player for the demand of high quality credits. And in that sense, if there is demand for only high quality credits, and high quality credits are going to be scrutinized, then the voluntary markets can really contribute to ambition globally. Otherwise, as it is now, it's a very mixed bag, in my opinion.
Thank you, Luca. Kelly, your view? Kelly, well, I move on to Martin because
she's muted.
She's muted now, yes. Don't know whether she can hear us, but in the meantime, I move to Martin.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I haven't entered into the discussions on voluntary markets in any great detail, but it seems to me that the voluntary markets have the challenge. What are the drivers of the voluntary market? And to my understanding, it's these carbon neutrality or climate neutrality claims are an emerging driver, and there are other corporate social responsibility drivers there as well. Including very specific climate targets. And I think one needs to look at that claim side, because it's driven by corporations' interest in making these claims, whether it's in a policy context or in a consumer context. And there's an enormous amount of criticism out there. I mean, we see it in the European Union over different sorts of claims that are being made. So I kind of think that the one thing the voluntary market, in the broadest definition of it, could do would be sort out what is meant by different claims and what is needed to satisfy different claims. So that's not so much about the offsetting side of it as it is the demand side. And I do think that Article 6 has, as Kelly has said, I put it slightly differently, it has enabled the voluntary market to deal with double counting by providing an opportunity to get an adjustment. But I don't think that's generally accepted in the voluntary market, that an adjustment is needed for an offset claim. Some say that it is, some say that it might be, etc. And I think also one needs to recognize the implications of that an adjustment is a sovereign asset in a way, right? And in a carbon constrained world, if we're to do what we say we're going to do, get to neutrality by mid-century, the costs of abatement are going to become quite high. And so certainly compliance credits are not going to be as cheap as we've seen in the past. And I kind of think voluntary credits as well will have that challenge, because the number available, the budget available from which to issue these things should be a diminishing amount. So I think the voluntary market has quite a lot of work to do in terms of figuring out the claim side, also figuring out what its approach to accounting is and how it responds to 6.2. And I think a longer term challenge, as standards need to align, addressing the issue of price and whether really cheap credits remain available.
Thank you, Martin. And last word by Billy.
Well, I had a thought, and it may actually go back to Martin or Luca for clarification. But I kind of imagine that one of the advantages of the Article 6.4 and the option to have it authorized is that I could go out and do a project in some country and buy that offset credit that's credentialed, and then ask for it to be authorized. And that would mean that, the NDC in that country effectively is lower and they're held to a tighter standard. And I might not, give that. I assume that I could choose not to give that to the government of the United States to comply with their NDC. So I'd actually be taking emissions out of the system. And, globally, in any country I wanted to do it that was willing to partner with me. And that option didn't previously exist. I mean, I could go to the EU and buy an allowance and retire it, but do I really want to help the EU or kind of go into the EU and do that? But now I can go into a developing country, I can do a project I can feel good about in a poor country, and I can pull it out.
Thank you, Billy. Looking at the clock, it's time to get to the conclusions very, very rapidly. Let me.
Sorry, Simone. I had a little trouble coming in earlier.
Yes.
Can I make a last point on VCM? I'm so sorry.
Please.
I think Billy's points are really important, as are others. But I think it may not be a black and white. It may not be you need to do corresponding adjustments now thing. It may be a transition question as well. There may be a moment for this private capital to help countries implement their current NDCs, but then we transition to where that becomes part of the country's responsibility and they have to overachieve in order to sell. Do you know what I mean? There may be a timing question on that we have to consider.
Yeah. Thank you, Kelly, for adding this reflection. That's quite important as well. So yes, it's 3:30. I'm afraid it's time to conclude very fast. Just a few take-home messages I think that we can take from this event. We long waited for Article 6. Now the kid is in town, and we have a set of rules that represent important requirements and safeguards for, let's say, robust and accountable international carbon markets. We made some progress, double counting, for instance, compared to months ago, but we also have to learn how these rules will be implemented, applied, and we have to take care of several possible loopholes in the system, like it was mentioned, the averaging approach, the CR carryover. I think we reflected on the voluntary carbon markets, or how much Article 6 will contribute to this. So in general, I think we made a great progress. Probably we have more than half of the glass full. Probably we have to take care of what is inside. Better a Chianti wine than just water. But we have to take care of the evolution and do not lower the guard on several aspects. So more to come for the future and more for future events of ours. So I thank you all. Please take 2 moments, less than 2 minutes, to answer the survey that Albert put in the chat. And with this, I pass on to Alberto for a final word.
Thank you very much, Simone. Very interesting debate. I learned a lot. So for me, it's just to thank all those who contribute to it. So clearly Martin, and then Kelly, Luca, Billy, you, Simone, Stefano, Ilaria, who opened, and last but by no means least, Chiara, who in the background has made this possible. Thank you very much to be with us today. And I guess this is the last of the debate of this series for this year. We'll see you in the new year. In the meanwhile, Merry Christmas, warm wishes for the festivities, and see you in the new year.